Nadim. Last time we were together, we read Mr. Noisy. This time, let's read a book about his friend, Mr. Small. He has a really funny story, and let's listen. Mr. Small. Mr. Small was very small, probably the smallest person you've ever seen in your life, or maybe the smallest person you've never seen in your life. Because he was so small, you probably wouldn't see him anyway. Mr. Small was about as big as a pin, which isn't very big at all. So perhaps we should say that Mr. Small was as small as a pin. Mr. Small lived in a small house underneath a daisy at the bottom of Mr. Robinson's garden. It was a very nice house, although very tiny, and it was suited Mr. Small very well indeed. He liked living there. Now, this is a story about the time Mr. Small decided to get a job. The trouble was, what sort of job could Mr. Small do? After all, there aren't that many small jobs. Mr. Small had thought about it for a long time, but he hadn't any ideas, not one. Do you guys have anything ideas what someone could do if they're that small? He was thinking about it now while he was having his lunch. He was having half a pea, 1 crumb, and a drop of lemonade. Mr. Small thought and thought while he was eating his big lunch, but it was of no use. Thinking just made him thirsty, so he had another drop of lemonade. I know, he thought to himself, after lunch, I'll go and see Mr. Robinson and ask his advice. So after lunch, he left his house and walked to the Robinsons' house at the top of the garden. It was quite a long walk for somebody as small as Mr. Small, and halfway there he stopped for a rest. He sat on a pebble, feeling quite out of breath. A worm crawled by and stopped. "Good afternoon, Mr. Small," said the worm. "Good afternoon, Walter," said Mr. Small to the worm, who he knew quite well. "Out for a walk, are you?" asked Walter. "Going to see Mr. Robinson," said Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter. "About a job," said Mr. Small. "Oh," said Walter the worm again, and he crawled off. Walter was a worm of very few words. After he'd rested for a while, Mr. Small set off again and walked off all the way west to the house, to Mr. Robinson's house, without stopping once. And when he got there, he climbed up the steps to Mr. Robinson's back door, and he knocked. Nobody heard him, and so he knocked again. Nobody heard him. The trouble was, you see, that if you're as small as Mr. Small, you don't have a very loud knock. Mr. Small looked up. There, high above his head, was a doorbell. "How can I ring the doorbell when I can't even reach it?" said Mr. Small to himself. He started to climb the wall, brick by brick, to reach the bell. He had climbed up 4 bricks when he made the mistake of looking down. "Oh, dear," he said, and he fell. "Ah! Bang! Ouch!" So Mr. Small started to rub his head. Just then Mr. Small had heard footsteps. It was the postman. The postman came to the door, posted his letters, and was just about to leave when he heard a voice. "Hello," said the voice. The postman looked down. "What? Hello," he said. "Who are you?" "I'm Mr. Small," said Mr. Small. "Will you ring the bell for me?" "Of course I will," replied the postman in answer to Mr. Small's question, and reaching out, he pressed the bell with his finger. "Thank you," said Mr. Small. "My pleasure," said the postman, and off he went. Mr. Small heard footsteps coming to the door. The door opened. Just like when you go to a friend's house and they open the door for you. Mr. Robinson opened the door and looked out. "That's funny," he said. "I'm sure I heard somebody ring the bell." He was about to shut the door when he heard a little voice. "Hello, hello, Mr. Robinson." Mr. Robinson looked down and down, down. "Hello, what are you doing here?" said Mr. Robinson. "I've come to ask your advice," said Mr. Small. "Well, you'd better come in and have a talk." Mr. Small followed Mr. Robinson into the house and perched on the arm of Mr. Robinson's favorite chair. He told him how he could think of a job that he could do. Mr. Robinson sipped a cup of tea and listened. "So you see," said Mr. Small, "how difficult it is." "I can see that," said Mr. Robinson, "but leave it to me." Mr. Robinson knew a lot of people, Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a restaurant, and he arranged for Mr. Small to work there, putting mustard into mustard pots so that people could have mustard at their tables. But Mr. Small kept falling into the pots of mustard, and he was covered in mustard, so he had to leave that job. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a sweet shop with candy and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, serving candy. But Mr. Small kept falling into the candy jars. And so he had to leave that job too. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked in a place where they made matches and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, packing matches into boxes. But Mr. Small kept getting shut in the boxes with the matches. That's how we light our Shabbos candles, right? You have to leave that job too. Mr. Robinson knew somebody who worked on a farm and arranged for Mr. Small to work there, sorting out the brown eggs from the white eggs. But Mr. Small kept getting trapped by the eggs, so he had to leave that job also. "What are we going to do with you?" said Mr. Robinson to Mr. Small one evening. "I don't know," said Mr. Small in a small voice. "I've got one more idea," said Mr. Robinson. "I know somebody who writes children's books. Perhaps you could work for him." That sounds like fun. So the following day, Mr. Robinson took Mr. Small to meet the man who wrote children's books. "Can I work for you, Mr. Small?" asked the man. "Yes, you can. Pass me that pencil and tell me about the jobs you've been doing. Then I'll write a book about all your jobs, and I'll call it Mr. Small," he said. "But children won't want to read a book all about me," said Mr. Small. "Oh, they will," said the man. "I think they'll like it very much." And you did, didn't you? You did like to hear a story all about Mr. Small, didn't you? He's a very good guy, and I really enjoy him. See you later. Bye.